Today, adultery is often a private matter. A broken marriage, a scandal whispered among friends, maybe a headline in the news. But centuries ago, infidelity was not a secret. It was a crime, and its punishment was a spectacle. In medieval villages and early modern cities, husbands and wives who strayed from their vows risked humiliation, pain, and sometimes death. The private act of love became the stage for public shame. If you enjoy this kind of content, please like the video and subscribe. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Now dim the lights, settle into your bed, and let your breathing slow. Imagine a world where desire was watched by neighbors, judged by priests, and punished by law. Tonight, we will walk quietly through that world, exploring the strange and often brutal punishments for adultery in the past. In the medieval world, adultery was not a simple betrayal of trust between two people. It was a wound that touched the very fabric of religion and society. To commit adultery was to defy not only one's spouse but also the will of God. From the pulpits of cathedrals and the wooden benches of small parish churches, priests thundered against it, reminding their flocks that desire, when misdirected, was dangerous for the soul and could invite eternal damnation. The Bible itself provided ample warning. In the Ten Commandments, the prohibition, "Thou shalt not commit adultery," stood alongside commands not to steal or kill. This was no minor slip, no ordinary temptation. To break this law was to break the covenant that tied individuals not only to their partners, but also to their Creator. The medieval mind saw marriage as sacred, blessed by God, and adultery as an open rebellion against divine order. It was more than a private sin, it was a cosmic offense. Sermons painted adultery in the darkest colors. Preachers compared adulterers to traitors, vipers, or thieves of purity. In stained glass and illuminated manuscripts, adultery was often depicted with scenes of punishment in hellfire. Men and women writhing among demons, their flesh scorched for lust. Such images were not mere decoration. They were warnings designed to haunt the faithful. The fear was not only of social disgrace but of eternal torment. The influence of the church went further than words. Confession required the faithful to admit even their most intimate sins, and adultery was among the gravest. A whispered admission in the darkness of a confessional could result in harsh penance, weeks of fasting, long pilgrimages, or public acts of humiliation meant to cleanse the sinner's soul. Even those punishments, however, were thought merciful compared to the fires of hell that awaited the unrepentant. Other religions carried similar weight. In Islamic law, adultery, known as zina, was considered a crime against both family and community. Though interpretations and punishments varied across regions and centuries, the stigma was always severe. Adultery was framed not only as betrayal of a spouse but as corruption of moral order, a sin that could bring dishonor to entire households. The Quran spoke of purity and fidelity, and in many communities the very survival of social trust depended on guarding them. In medieval Judaism, too, adultery was treated as a grave sin. The Torah prescribed death for adulterers, and rabbinical courts wrestled with the tension between mercy and justice. Even when the harshest punishments were rare, the shame was lasting. The stigma of adultery was not easily erased. It followed families for generations. A woman suspected of infidelity could lose her standing in her community, her marriage, even her right to live in peace. What unites these traditions is the idea that adultery was not merely a breach of personal loyalty. It was a violation of sacred law, an offense against God Himself. To betray one's spouse was to pollute the spiritual fabric of society. Children born of such unions were often stigmatized as illegitimate, carrying the weight of sin they had not chosen. Families torn by adultery were not seen only as broken, but as tainted. The act of two individuals had consequences that rippled across households, communities, and even generations. The power of religion gave adultery its lasting sting. Unlike theft, which might be forgiven with repayment, or anger, which might be calmed with time, adultery was cast as a corruption of purity itself. It stained not only the body but also the soul. And in a world where eternal destiny hung in the balance, No stain could be more terrifying. Fear was the great weapon. Fear of hell, fear of divine wrath, fear of losing one's place in the sacred community. The punishment of adultery, then, began long before the stake or the lash. It began in the pulpit, in the whispered prayers of the guilty, in the silence of those who knew their souls were already condemned. Adultery in the past was never viewed as a private mistake alone. It was considered a dangerous crack in the structure of family and community. In a time when family lineage determined wealth, power, and survival, sexual loyalty was more than affection. It was the thread that held inheritance, alliances, and social order together. To betray that trust could destabilize not only a household, but an entire political system. Marriage in medieval and early modern societies was rarely about love in the modern sense. It was about property, bloodlines, and alliances. A noble woman's body was not seen as hers alone, but as a vessel for heirs, a channel through which estates and dynasties would pass. For her to take a lover was to risk confusion over paternity. A single illegitimate child could poison a line of succession, bringing disputes and even wars. Kings and nobles were obsessed with securing legitimate heirs, and adultery threatened to unravel dynasties. Even among peasants, fidelity had enormous weight. Land, though modest, passed through families, and disputes over inheritance could destroy fragile households. A wife's adultery threatened not only her honor, but the legitimacy of children who might one day inherit. A man accused of raising another's offspring faced shame and ruin. In small villages, gossip about infidelity could fracture trust, sour marriages, and create feuds between families that might last for years. The suspicion of adultery was often enough to cause disaster. A jealous husband might accuse his wife to protect his name, even if he lacked proof. Communities often took his side, for an unfaithful wife was seen as a danger, not just to her husband, but to the entire village order. Women bore the heaviest burden, for their sexuality was viewed as something to be controlled, surveilled, and disciplined. Men who strayed were often excused as weak, but women who did the same were branded corrupt, dangerous, and dishonorable. At the level of rulers, adultery could be a weapon of politics. Queens accused of infidelity faced not only shame, but execution. Anne Boleyn, second wife of Henry VIII, was charged with adultery and incest as part of a political plot. Whether guilty or not, the accusation alone was enough to justify her downfall. Similar cases echoed across Europe. Noble women accused of infidelity lost their crowns, their lives, or their dynasties. A whisper of adultery could topple thrones. For men in power, too, adultery could destroy reputations. A nobleman caught in an affair with the wife of another lord risked not only scandal, but blood feud. To touch another man's wife was to insult his honor, a provocation that demanded vengeance. Entire wars were sparked by such betrayals. The legendary Trojan War, though wrapped in myth, reflected this cultural reality. The abduction of another man's wife could unleash chaos on a vast scale. Religious institutions reinforced this idea. The church spoke of adultery as pollution, not just of the soul, but of society. Priests warned that infidelity invited divine punishment not only on the guilty, but on the community that tolerated it. Failed harvests, plagues, or disasters were sometimes interpreted as God's wrath for hidden sins of lust. This gave neighbors reason to watch one another closely. A single act of adultery might condemn a whole village, and so surveillance became a duty. Shame and reputation were currencies as valuable as coin. An adulterous scandal could bankrupt a family socially. Daughters might no longer marry well. Sons might be refused apprenticeships or alliances. The stain spread outward, touching kin and descendants. In such a world, the policing of sexuality was not merely about morality. It was about survival. Seen from our modern lens, it may appear absurd that a private act could wield such power. Yet for people of the past, adultery was a kind of treason. It betrayed the sacred contract of marriage, risked corrupting bloodlines, and endangered the honor of entire households. It was not the passion itself that frightened communities, but the instability it brought. Adultery threatened the invisible architecture of power, honor, and inheritance. To punish it harshly was to defend not only morality, but the very continuity of society. In the tightly woven fabric of medieval and early modern communities, adultery could rarely remain secret. Villages, towns, and even noble courts thrived on gossip, suspicion, and the watchful eyes of neighbors. Privacy, as we understand it today, hardly existed. Lives were lived in shared spaces, families crowded together in single rooms, servants hovered in halls, and walls were thin. To stray from marital vows was to risk exposure, and exposure meant not only scandal but punishment. Women, in particular, lived under near constant surveillance. Their movements were tracked by husbands, in-laws, servants, and even neighbors. A woman seen walking alone with a man not her husband could spark rumors that quickly snowballed into accusations. A servant who carried messages between lovers might betray them to avoid suspicion themselves. The household, meant to be a shelter, often became a cage. Men, though afforded more freedom, were not entirely spared. An affair with a married woman placed them in danger of retribution. A rival husband might denounce them publicly, dragging the matter before local courts. Adultery was not only a personal shame, but a legal matter, and community testimony carried great weight. Gossip was not idle chatter, it was evidence. The church actively encouraged this culture of denunciation. Priests preached that concealing adultery was itself sinful. Parishioners were urged to confess not only their own sins, but also the sins of others, to ensure the purity of the community. Spies of morality were everywhere. A neighbor's watchful glance, a servant's loose tongue, even a child's innocent words could unravel the secrecy of an affair. In cities, the network of surveillance was even stronger. Guilds, parish groups, and civic authorities often acted as moral overseers. In some places, officials known as morals wardens patrolled the streets, empowered to investigate rumors of infidelity. Inns, taverns, and bathhouses were closely watched, their reputations tied to the virtue, or vice, of their patrons. Those who strayed were swiftly noticed. For nobles, the stakes were even higher. Court life was a labyrinth of eyes and ears. Courtiers sought advantage in whispers, and the accusation of adultery could be a deadly weapon. To denounce a rival as unfaithful was to cast a shadow over their entire lineage. Sometimes false accusations were as dangerous as real ones. The mere suggestion of adultery was enough to ruin reputations, unsettle marriages, and stir political storms. Punishments often began with denunciation. The accused might be dragged before church courts based solely on rumor. Testimonies from neighbors could condemn a woman without proof. Once accused, innocence was difficult to prove. The spectacle of suspicion itself served the purpose. It reminded the community that private acts were never beyond the reach of public judgment. Fear of denunciation shaped behavior. Couples avoided lingering glances in public, for even the suspicion of affection outside marriage was dangerous. Letters were written in codes or hidden within household goods. Rendezvous took place in barns, forests, or deserted chapels. Yet no secrecy was safe from the watchful eyes of a village. Eyes and ears were everywhere, and loyalty was always divided. This culture of surveillance was not simply about morality, it was about power. Husbands could use accusations to control their wives. Rivals could use rumors to eliminate competition. The church could use confession and denunciation to maintain its authority. Adultery, therefore, became less about the act itself and more about the web of control it revealed. To live under such scrutiny was to live with constant anxiety. Desire had to be hidden, and even innocence could not guarantee safety. A chance word or a bitter neighbor could ignite scandal. In this way, punishment for adultery often began long before the lash, the stake, or the shameful procession. It began in the whispers, in the sidelong glances, in the tightening grip of a society determined to see and to judge. To be caught in adultery was not only to risk the wrath of one's spouse, but to face the collective gaze of the community. One of the most common punishments across medieval Europe was exposure, dragging the private shame of infidelity into the most public of spaces. Adulterers were placed at the center of marketplaces, churchyards, or crossroads, where everyone could see and where humiliation was amplified by the crowd's judgment. The pillory was perhaps the most infamous tool of exposure. With head and hands locked into wooden boards, the guilty stood helpless, while passers-by jeered, mocked, and hurled rotten food or stones. Men accused of seducing married women were forced to endure this punishment in full view of their neighbors. Women, too, were displayed in this way, sometimes with signs hung around their necks reading "Adulteress" or "whore." The humiliation was doubled by the fact that once exposed, the shame lingered long after the punishment ended. Everyone in the village remembered the face locked in wood. Other forms of public display were equally cruel. Couples caught in adultery might be forced to march through the streets together, half naked, bound by ropes or chains, symbols of their shared guilt. Crowds followed them, laughing, spitting, and shouting insults. Children threw stones while elders muttered prayers for the community's cleansing. The punishment was designed not only to degrade the guilty, but also to reaffirm the moral order of the community. In some towns, adulterous women were paraded through the streets, riding backward on a donkey, a position that symbolized inversion and disgrace. With their hair loose and their clothes torn, they became living warnings of what awaited those who strayed. Husbands and wives who remained faithful could watch and feel reassured that justice was served, while the guilty became a spectacle of dishonor. The church often joined in these rituals of exposure. A sinner might be forced to stand barefoot at the doors of a cathedral, dressed in nothing but a thin shift, holding a candle as a sign of penitence. On Sundays, as parishioners entered for Mass, they would see the adulterer shivering in shame, a living sermon about the wages of sin. The line between spiritual penance and social punishment blurred. The cruelty of exposure lay not only in the act itself, but in its permanence. A beating might heal, but public disgrace left scars that never faded. Neighbors would whisper for years, pointing out the site where a woman once stood in the pillory or the street where a man was paraded in shame. Even after formal punishment ended, the memory remained alive in the community. This spectacle also served as entertainment. For peasants living hard, monotonous lives, the humiliation of others provided a grim kind of amusement. Market days and feast days often featured such punishments, drawing large crowds. The boundary between justice and theater blurred. Adulterers were not just punished. They were made into living plays of disgrace, staged for the moral instruction and perverse enjoyment of their neighbors. Yet, for all its cruelty, exposure was also practical. It spared the expense of prisons, shifting the burden of punishment onto the community itself. The crowd became judge, jury, and executioner of shame. By mocking and jeering, neighbors reinforced their own virtue, reassuring themselves that they were safe from similar disgrace. In a world where reputation was everything, exposure was devastating. A woman once paraded in shame might never remarry. Her children could suffer from her dishonor. A man disgraced in the pillory might find himself ruined in trade or stripped of his guild membership. The punishment was not just a moment. It was a life sentence written on the memory of the community. Public exposures, then, were less about pain than about permanence. They turned adultery into a spectacle, reminding everyone that the most private of sins could become the most public of humiliations. Humiliation could take many shapes, and one of the most striking forms was the use of clothing and symbols to mark adulterers. The idea was simple. If someone had betrayed their vows in secret, then their body would be forced to carry that secret in public. For hours, days, or even weeks, their shame would be worn like a costume. In many villages, a woman convicted of adultery might be forced to wear garments that exaggerated her sexuality, dresses torn to expose her body, or shifts cut so that she looked half naked. Instead of being alluring, the effect was degrading. Neighbors who once whispered behind her back could now laugh openly as she shuffled through the streets dressed in ridicule. The body that had been the site of her sin became the stage of her punishment. For men, humiliation often came in the form of horns. Across Europe, the cuckold's horns became a universal symbol of betrayal. Husbands whose wives strayed were mocked as weak, their honor diminished. But in some punishments, the horns were placed on the heads of adulterers themselves. Men accused of seducing married women were marched through towns wearing antlers or heavy wooden horns strapped to their foreheads. The symbol was unmistakable. The man had brought dishonor, and now he would carry it physically. Sometimes both lovers were humiliated together. They might be forced to wear matching costumes, tied by ropes, and paraded for the community. Ridiculous hats, jingling bells, or painted masks marked them out as objects of scorn. Their humiliation was theatrical, designed to draw laughter as much as disgust. Children chased them, mocking their appearance, while adults jeered. It was a carnival of shame where laughter became another form of punishment. Other symbols were even more absurd. In parts of Germany, adulterers were made to wear enormous wooden necklaces carved into phallic or vaginal shapes, dragging them through the streets as crude reminders of their crimes. In Italy, couples might be paraded with drums or pots tied around their necks, the clatter amplifying their disgrace. In some towns, men were forced to ride backwards on donkeys while wearing women's clothing, a humiliation that stripped them of both dignity and masculinity. These punishments worked because symbols were powerful. In a society where most people could not read, visual cues carried enormous weight. Horns, drums, torn clothes, or backward riders told everyone at a glance what crime had been committed. The shame did not need explanation. It was visible, immediate, and unforgettable. The church sometimes sanctioned these practices, framing them as penance. To be dressed in humiliating garb and exposed before the parish was to confess one's sins not with words but with the body. Yet the boundary between penance and mockery was thin. Crowds delighted in the spectacle, turning sacred correction into popular entertainment. For the adulterers themselves, the punishment was crushing. Long after the horns were removed or the torn shift discarded, the memory lingered. A man once marched with antlers on his head might forever be called the cuckold. A woman once displayed in a tattered gown might find herself mocked years later. Symbols, once attached, could never truly be removed. There is a curious irony in these punishments. By dressing adulterers in exaggerated or obscene costumes, communities ensured that the very thing they claimed to condemn, sexuality, was placed at the center of attention. A woman's body became an object of scrutiny not only for her lover, but for her entire village. A man's virility, mocked with horns or phallic tokens, became the focus of collective laughter. The community punished the sinner, but in doing so, it indulged in the very obsession it pretended to repress. Ridiculous clothes and symbols were not just about ridicule, they were about control. They reminded everyone that reputation was fragile, and that the community had the power to define, mark, and display a person's identity. In this way, punishment extended beyond the guilty. It served as a warning to all. Public punishments for adultery were rarely simple or straightforward. They often took the form of elaborate rituals, choreographed displays of disgrace that combined theater, religion, and law. These rituals were designed not just to punish the guilty, but to reaffirm the moral order of the entire community. Everyone was expected to watch, to participate, and to remember. One common ritual was the charivari, or skimmington ride, practiced in parts of France, England, and Germany. When news of an adulterous affair spread, villagers gathered in noisy processions. Pots, pans, drums, and horns created a clamor that echoed through the streets. Sometimes, effigies of the adulterers were paraded on carts, beaten with sticks, or even burned in mock trials. In other cases, the actual culprits were forced to ride backwards on donkeys while the crowd jeered and shouted. These events blurred the line between justice and festival, turning punishment into a carnival of ridicule. Church rituals could be equally elaborate. Adulterers might be summoned to stand before the congregation during Sunday Mass, barefoot and clad only in thin garments. With ashes on their heads or ropes around their necks, they confessed their sins aloud while the priest pronounced their guilt. The congregation responded with prayers, sometimes even curses. It was a public theater of repentance, binding the sinner's humiliation to the sacred rhythm of worship. Some rituals emphasized endurance. Adulterers were sometimes forced to walk long distances through towns and villages, carrying heavy crosses or dragging chains behind them. These penitential journeys made suffering visible and continuous, prolonging shame with every step. By the time the guilty reached their destination, often a church or public square, they were exhausted, broken, and utterly exposed to the mockery of those who followed them. Communities invented rituals that blended cruelty with comedy. In certain regions, adulterous couples were made to dance together in public, forced to embrace while the crowd laughed at their shame. In others, they were tied together with ropes and paraded like livestock. The absurdity was deliberate. By turning love into farce, communities stripped adultery of its secrecy and turned intimacy into a grotesque performance. Children were often encouraged to take part. They shouted, sang mocking rhymes, or chased the punished through the streets. This was no accident. By involving the youngest members of society, rituals of shame reinforced moral lessons across generations. Children learned early that adultery was dangerous, disgraceful, and certain to bring ridicule. The collective nature of these rituals gave them power. Adultery was not punished behind closed doors or in private chambers. It was punished before neighbors, kin, and strangers alike. Shame was magnified by the number of eyes that witnessed it. The more the crowd laughed, the deeper the wound. At times, these rituals could escalate into violence. Crowds, drunk on collective mockery, sometimes threw stones, mud, or worse. What began as laughter could turn into cruelty. Adulterers risked serious injury, even death, in what was officially a ritual of discipline. The thin line between performance and mob justice was easily crossed. For the guilty, the humiliation was devastating. Unlike prison sentences, which could be hidden from view, rituals of shame left a mark that could not be erased. Neighbors remembered. Children who had laughed grew into adults who repeated the story. Families carried the disgrace long after the punishment ended. Shame rituals ensured that adultery was not a fleeting scandal, but a permanent stain. Yet these rituals also reveal a deep truth about the societies that practiced them. They were obsessed with control. By turning adultery into public theater, communities reinforced their own cohesion. They reminded each member that personal desires were secondary to collective morality. The laughter, the jeers, the mockery, all were tools of discipline. The guilty were punished, yes, but the community was also reassured of its own righteousness. When public shame was not enough, the body itself became the canvas of punishment. Adultery was seen as a physical act of betrayal, and so it was often answered with physical pain. Communities believed that the sting of the lash or the ache of the rod could purge the soul and warn others never to follow the same path. Whipping was one of the most common punishments. In marketplaces or churchyards, adulterers were stripped to the waist and lashed with whips or rods. Each stroke landed not only on the skin, but also on the reputation. The screams echoed across the square, mingling with the jeers of onlookers. A whipping was rarely fatal, but it left scars, both visible and invisible, that marked the guilty long after the crowd had dispersed. In some regions, the punishment was carefully ritualized. Men might be flogged a set number of times for every night they were accused of adultery. Women might be beaten publicly while reciting prayers, the blows falling in rhythm with the words. These ceremonies were meant to cleanse, as if pain could scrub away lust. Yet the spectacle always ensured that punishment was as much about entertainment as it was about discipline. The rod and the switch were also tools of humiliation. Adulterers might be forced to bend and receive strokes in front of their neighbors, treated like disobedient children. The act reduced grown men and women to objects of ridicule. In some towns, lovers were beaten together, tied side by side, so that each blow reminded them of their shared guilt. Beyond whipping, other corporal punishments were employed. Branding was used in certain places, a hot iron pressed into the skin to leave a permanent mark. Letters such as A for adulterer were seared into flesh, ensuring that the shame could never be hidden. The scar became a lifelong confession, visible to all. Some punishments sought to exhaust rather than wound. Adulterers were forced to carry heavy stones through towns, their arms trembling under the burden. Others were made to kneel on sharp stones for hours until their knees bled. The pain was sharp, the lesson unforgettable. Communities believed that physical suffering could restore moral balance, even if it meant crippling the body. For women, corporal punishment was especially brutal. Stripped of dignity, they were beaten, while their hair was torn loose, a sign of disgrace. Some were forced to endure their punishment in the nude, furthering their humiliation. Men, too, faced violence, but women often carried the heavier burden, for their bodies were seen as the vessels of honor and shame. These punishments were not confined to peasants. Nobles, though often spared the lash, faced their own forms of corporal discipline. A noblewoman accused of adultery might be confined and beaten by her husband's household. Noblemen caught in affairs risked duels, where wounds or death replaced the lash. Violence was universal, though the form it took depended on class and rank. The paradox of corporal punishment is clear. Adultery was condemned as a violation of the sacred body, yet the response was to violate the body further. The flesh became the battleground where morality was enforced. Every bruise and scar was a reminder that desire had consequences and that the community had the power to write punishment directly onto the skin. These punishments also reveal how societies blurred the line between justice and cruelty. Crowds gathered not only to witness discipline but also to enjoy it. The pain of the guilty became a spectacle, a grim kind of theater that reaffirmed communal values through suffering. The whip cracked, the rod struck, and the community felt reassured that order had been restored. For those who endured it, however, corporal punishment was not cleansing, it was shattering. The body carried the memory of every strike, and the heart carried the deeper wound of being reduced to public sport. The punishment ended in hours, but the humiliation lasted a lifetime. If whipping and beatings scarred the skin, mutilations scarred for life. In many societies, adultery was seen as such a dangerous crime that temporary pain was not enough. The guilty had to be marked permanently, their bodies turned into lifelong warnings. These punishments were extreme, violent, and meant to ensure that no one could ever forget the sin or the sinner. One of the most common forms of mutilation was the cutting of the nose. In parts of medieval Europe and the Middle East, women accused of adultery were punished by having their noses slit or cut off entirely. The reasoning was cruelly symbolic. The nose, visible at all times, could never be hidden. A disfigured face became an eternal badge of dishonor. For women, whose value in marriage was tied to beauty and appearance, this punishment destroyed any hope of a future alliance. It condemned them not only to pain, but to lifelong exclusion. Men, too, were mutilated. In some cases, adulterers had their ears cut off, leaving them visibly marked as dishonorable. In harsher instances, men were castrated, a punishment meant both to end their sexual transgressions and to humiliate them utterly. These acts were savage, reducing human beings to broken bodies in the name of justice. Communities justified them as deterrents. If one man lost his manhood for adultery, perhaps others would think twice. Branding was another form of permanent mark. A hot iron seared letters or symbols into the flesh of adulterers, an A for adulterer, or sometimes more elaborate designs. These scars could not be erased. They burned through the skin into memory. To walk with such a mark was to carry shame on one's body forever, a punishment that no time or repentance could undo. Some punishments were designed with grim creativity. In certain places, women accused of adultery had their hair shaved off, stripping them of a key marker of femininity. In societies where long hair symbolized virtue, baldness proclaimed guilt. Other women were forced to wear iron collars or chains permanently, a form of living imprisonment that announced their disgrace wherever they went. The cruelty of mutilation lay not only in the pain of the act, but in its aftermath. To lose a nose, an ear, or a piece of flesh was not simply to suffer. It was to become visibly other, to be branded as outside the community of the virtuous. Survivors of mutilation often lived in isolation, rejected even by their families. Their very faces became symbols of shame. Religious authorities sometimes defended mutilation as justice ordained by God. Biblical and Quranic passages were interpreted as sanctioning severe punishments, though in practice these interpretations varied widely. Some judges and clerics resisted such cruelty, preferring penance or exile. Others, however, insisted that mutilation was the only way to preserve order and purity. In their eyes, the body that had sinned had to bear the mark of its corruption. For the guilty, mutilation was a fate worse than death. Death ended shame, but mutilation prolonged it. To live disfigured was to live as a warning, to embody punishment with every breath. No repentance, no prayer, no good deed could undo the visible mark. The community's judgment was carved into the body, permanent and merciless. When we look back, these punishments may seem barbaric, almost unthinkable. Yet in their cruelty, they tell us something profound. Adultery was not just about desire, it was about honor, inheritance, and control. And to violate those things was to risk not only pain, but the destruction of one's very identity. When it came to adultery, punishment was rarely equal. Men and women might both be accused, but the weight of shame and severity of discipline fell disproportionately on women. Across cultures and centuries, the double standard was clear. Men's transgressions were often excused or minimized, while women's were magnified, condemned, and punished with greater cruelty. The roots of this imbalance lay in how societies viewed sexuality. A man's infidelity was often seen as a weakness of the flesh, a lapse that could be forgiven. For women, however, adultery was framed as a betrayal of the very core of social order. A woman's body was tied to family honor, lineage, and inheritance. If she strayed, the legitimacy of children, and therefore the integrity of bloodlines, was called into question. Inheritance disputes, property rights, and dynastic succession all hinged on certainty about paternity. For this reason, female fidelity was policed with relentless vigilance. Punishments reflected this logic. Men caught in adultery might face fines, temporary shaming, or light beatings. Women accused of the same crime could be whipped, mutilated, paraded through streets, or even executed. The assumption was that women's sexuality was more dangerous, more destabilizing, and therefore required harsher control. Even when punishments were officially the same, their impact was unequal. A branded man might still find work or remarry, his shame fading with time. A branded woman, however, might be shunned entirely, her dishonor poisoning her children's prospects and staining her family's reputation. Communities were far less forgiving of women, treating them as perpetual bearers of guilt. The hypocrisy extended to men's roles in adultery. A husband could denounce his wife and expect support from neighbors and priests. A wife who accused her husband of infidelity, however, was often ignored or ridiculed. Male adultery was tolerated, even joked about, while female adultery was treated as catastrophe. Men's pleasure was excused, women's desire was demonized. In noble courts, these double standards were especially visible. Kings and lords openly kept mistresses, their affairs tolerated or even celebrated. Queens and noblewomen, by contrast, risked everything if they strayed. Rumors of infidelity could strip them of crowns, freedom, and life. Anne Boleyn, accused of adultery, was executed not only for betrayal, but for daring to wield sexual power as a woman. History remembers countless men for their conquests. It remembers women for their punishments. Religious teachings reinforce the imbalance. Priests often preached more harshly against women than men, warning that women were the weaker vessel, more easily led into temptation and more dangerous when they sinned. Eve's role in the fall was invoked as proof that women's desire was inherently suspect. In confession, women often received harsher penances for adultery than men, reflecting the belief that their sins weighed heavier on the community. The surveillance system mirrored this inequality. Women's movements were monitored constantly by husbands, fathers, in-laws, and even neighbors. Men moved more freely, their nights at taverns or brothels overlooked. Women who walked alone at night risked suspicion. Men who did the same faced little scrutiny. The community's gaze fell disproportionately on female bodies, treating them as sites of both temptation and danger. Even in folklore and popular culture, the imbalance appeared. Jokes about cuckolded men might sting their pride, but jokes about adulterous women often carried venom, casting them as scheming, lustful, and dangerous. Stories of women punished for infidelity circulated as cautionary tales, teaching daughters that their worth depended entirely on chastity and loyalty. These gender differences reveal how deeply intertwined adultery was with power. Controlling women's sexuality meant controlling inheritance, property, and reputation. By punishing women more harshly, communities protected patriarchal structures that gave men dominance over families and resources. Adultery, then, was not simply about love or lust. It was about who held control over the body and its consequences. For women, the risk of punishment was lifelong. A single accusation could end a marriage, destroy a family, or lead to death. For men, the risks were smaller, often cushioned by privilege and forgiveness. The imbalance was not hidden, it was accepted, even justified, as the natural order. And in that acceptance lay centuries of injustice, where women's bodies carried the heaviest weight of shame. When accusations of adultery reached beyond gossip and rumor, they often entered the solemn world of courts and trials. Justice for adultery was not always left to mobs or village rituals. In many regions, it was a matter for judges, scribes, and official sentences. Yet even here, the line between law and spectacle blurred. Trials were not only about determining guilt, they were about reinforcing the moral codes that bound society together. Local courts, both secular and ecclesiastical, frequently dealt with cases of infidelity. In small towns, the parish priest might summon adulterers to church courts, where spiritual authority carried legal weight. These hearings could be surprisingly formal. Witnesses testified, neighbors swore oaths, and scribes recorded every detail. A woman accused of adultery might face questions about her movements, her clothing, even the glances she exchanged with men. Testimonies of servants, children, or neighbors often sealed her fate. The burden of proof was uneven. Men's denials were often accepted at face value, while women's protests of innocence were dismissed as deceit. Courts leaned heavily on reputation evidence. If a woman was rumored to be unchaste, it was enough to justify a sentence. Truth mattered less than perception. Once suspicion attached itself, it was nearly impossible to wash away. Punishments handed down by courts varied widely. Some imposed fines, forcing guilty parties to pay money to husbands, wives, or local authorities. Others ordered public penance, standing barefoot in church, confessing before the congregation, or walking through town in shame. Severe cases could result in corporal punishment or even execution, especially if adultery was linked to treason, heresy, or blasphemy. For nobles and rulers, accusations of adultery could become lethal political weapons, disguising power struggles as moral outrage. In parts of Europe, trial procedures could be bizarre. Trial by ordeal was sometimes invoked, especially in earlier centuries. A woman accused of adultery might be forced to hold a red-hot iron or to plunge her hand into boiling water, with the belief that divine power would protect the innocent. If her wounds healed cleanly, she was declared pure. If not, her guilt was proven. Such rituals blurred law, religion, and superstition into a cruel theater of judgment. For men, trials could also be perilous, though often less so. A man accused of seducing another's wife might face duels instead of courts. Honor demanded satisfaction, and trials of steel were seen as a way to let God decide the truth. Blood spilled in these combats served as proof, and the loser's disgrace was taken as evidence of guilt. The presence of courts also gave communities a sanctioned outlet for anxieties about morality. Bringing an adulterer before a judge allowed neighbors to release their fears into the hands of authority. The ritual of testimony, the solemnity of oaths, and the pronouncement of judgment reassured everyone that order was being preserved. Whether guilty or innocent, the accused became a vessel through which society reasserted its values. Yet the courts themselves were not always neutral. Judges were men of their time, influenced by the same fears, biases, and prejudices as the communities they served. They often sided with husbands over wives, nobles over peasants, men over women. Adultery trials thus reflected not impartial justice, but the hierarchies of the world around them. Still, the formality of trials gave them a weight that gossip and rumor could not. Written records, sealed sentences, and official punishments created permanence. A shame endured in the marketplace might fade with time, but a sentence recorded in a court roll could follow a family for generations. Even centuries later, historians uncovering these documents can trace the weight of adultery in the ink of scribes. For those who stood accused, the trial was both terrifying and hopeless. To face neighbors testifying against them, to stand before a stern judge, to know that reputation outweighed truth, this was punishment before punishment. The words spoken in those chambers often mattered more than the acts themselves. In the end, Courts and trials for adultery were less about discovering fact than about enshrining fear, discipline, and control into law. If the courts gave adultery the form of law, the church gave it the weight of eternity. For centuries, the church was not just a moral authority, but also a judicial power, and its influence penetrated every household. To commit adultery was not simply to break a marriage vow, it was to defy God, endanger one's soul, and risk the salvation of the entire community. Church courts handled countless cases of infidelity. Priests summoned parishioners to answer accusations, often based on little more than rumor or confession. A woman might be called to explain why she was seen walking with a man at dusk. A man might be questioned for lingering in a widow's home. The line between suspicion and evidence was thin, for the church believed that God's eye saw everything, and human courts merely confirmed his judgment. Confession was one of the church's strongest tools. Parishioners were required to confess their sins, and adultery was one of the gravest admissions. A whispered word in the darkness of a confessional could unleash severe penance. Some were ordered to fast for weeks, abstain from marital intimacy, or undertake pilgrimages to holy sites. Others were forced to stand in front of their congregation, dressed in penitential garments, holding candles or crosses as they declared their guilt. The church thus turned private shame into a public sermon. The rituals of penance were often humiliating. Adulterers might be required to crawl on their knees through church aisles or to lie prostrate before the altar. Ashes were sprinkled on their heads as signs of disgrace. Ropes were tied around their necks to mark their subjugation. The body that had sinned was made to suffer visibly in the house of God. These acts were meant to cleanse, but they also reinforced the church's immense power. Excommunication was the ultimate threat. An adulterer who refused penance risked being cast out of the church, denied the sacraments, and cut off from the community of the faithful. In a world where salvation was everything, this punishment was terrifying. To be excommunicated was to be spiritually dead, wandering without hope of heaven. Families and friends often shunned the excommunicated, for their presence was believed to bring divine wrath upon the community. Clergy also used sermons to terrify the faithful into obedience. Priests described adulterers writhing in hellfire, their bodies tormented by demons. Medieval art echoed these warnings. Frescoes and stained glass showed sinners devoured by flames or dragged into darkness. Every glance at these images reminded parishioners that adultery was not merely a mistake, but a path to eternal damnation. The church also controlled marriage itself. Priests officiated weddings, blessed unions, and declared them sacred contracts. To betray marriage was thus to betray the church directly. Annulments and separations were difficult to obtain, and adultery was one of the rare grounds considered, though usually to the disadvantage of women. Husbands could sometimes rid themselves of unfaithful wives, but wives who accused husbands found little support. The church's role was not limited to punishment, it also shaped how society understood sexuality. Desire was cast as dangerous, lust as sin. Women were seen as temptresses, men as weak but forgivable. These teachings created the framework that justified unequal punishments and harsh control of female bodies. The pulpit reinforced what the courtroom declared. Adultery was both a legal crime and a spiritual disease. For the faithful, the church's authority meant that punishment for adultery was never confined to the earthly realm. Even if a court imposed a fine or whipping, the greater fear was of eternal torment. Hell loomed larger than any pillory. Thus, many endured harsh penances, pilgrimages, and humiliations willingly, desperate to secure forgiveness before death. The role of the church in punishing adultery reveals how deeply religion shaped daily life. The body, the family, the community, and the soul were all bound together under its authority. To sin in secret was impossible, for even if neighbors were blind, God saw. And through his priests, his judges, and his rituals, that vision was transformed into punishment on earth. While many punishments for adultery revolved around shame, ridicule, or physical pain, there were times when the penalties reached their most terrifying extreme: death. In some societies, adultery was treated not only as sin, but as a crime worthy of execution. These cases, though not as common as public humiliations, burned themselves into the memory of communities, becoming cautionary tales whispered for generations. In medieval Europe, executions for adultery were rare, but not unheard of. Stoning, though more often associated with biblical texts and Islamic law, occasionally appeared in practice. More common were burnings or hangings, particularly when adultery was linked to treason or heresy. A queen accused of infidelity, for example, risked not only dishonor but the perception that her illegitimate children might one day inherit a throne. In such cases, adultery was framed as a threat to kingdoms, and the punishment was made spectacular to preserve dynastic stability. The execution of noblewomen often carried political motives. Anne Boleyn, wife of Henry VIII of England, was famously executed in 1536, accused of adultery and incest. Whether guilty or not, the charges served a purpose. They removed a queen whose influence had waned and cleared the way for the king's next marriage. Her death was justified as punishment for sexual betrayal, but it was equally about politics and power. Such examples remind us that accusations of adultery could be as much weapons as judgments. In some regions of the Middle East and South Asia, harsher applications of religious law led to executions for adultery. These punishments, often stoning, were carried out to emphasize the seriousness of sexual purity and protecting family and community. Though scholars debated the interpretations, the fear remained real. Adultery was not simply shameful, it could be fatal. Peasants, too, sometimes faced deadly consequences. A woman accused of repeated infidelity might be drowned, her body cast into a river as a symbol of cleansing. Men might be hanged from trees at the edges of villages, their bodies left as warnings. These extreme measures were often less about justice than about spectacle. The public was invited to watch, to feel horror, and to internalize the message. Adultery was not only dangerous, it was mortal. Communities sometimes improvised their own extreme cases outside the law. Angry husbands or families took matters into their own hands, killing suspected adulterers in fits of vengeance. Such acts were often tolerated, even excused by authorities, for the dishonor of adultery was seen as provocation enough. Blood spilled in passion could be rationalized as the restoration of honor. Even when execution was not the outcome, punishments could be so extreme that survival was uncertain. Women mutilated beyond recognition often lived lives of exile, effectively dead to their families and neighbors. Men castrated for adultery might linger in shame and weakness, their lives reduced to misery. These punishments, though not executions in name, carried the same message. Adultery could erase a person from society. What is striking about these extreme cases is how they reveal the fragility of social order. Adultery, an act of intimacy, threatened to unravel the threads of inheritance, honor, and divine law. In response, communities sometimes chose to make examples that were unforgettable. The smoke of a pyre, the limp body on a gallows, the stones piled over a corpse, all became symbols etched into collective memory. For the guilty, there was no redemption in these punishments. Unlike penance or public shame, which allowed for repentance, death was final. The soul might find mercy in heaven, but on earth the body was destroyed as a warning. Communities ensured that the lesson of fidelity was written not only in sermons, but in blood and fire. Behind the punishments for adultery lay not only anonymous peasants and forgotten villagers, but also figures whose names still echo in history. When queens, nobles, or other prominent people were accused, their cases became spectacles of scandal and power. The higher their status, the greater the fall, and the more vivid the example left behind. One of the most famous stories is that of Anne Boleyn, the second wife of King Henry VIII. In 1536, she was accused of adultery, incest, and treason. Whether these charges were true remains doubtful, but they served a political purpose. Henry wished to rid himself of Anne so that he could marry Jane Seymour, and accusations of adultery provided the justification. Anne's trial was a grand display. Nobles sat in judgment, witnesses testified, and the Queen herself was forced to defend her honor. Convicted, she was executed by sword. Her downfall showed how adultery could be wielded as a weapon of power, cloaked in morality but driven by politics. Another infamous case comes from France. Marguerite de Bourgogne, daughter-in-law of King Philip IV. In 1314, she and her sisters-in-law were accused of adultery in what became known as the Tour de Nesle affair. The women were said to have taken lovers in a Parisian tower. When discovered, Marguerite was imprisoned, her reputation ruined, and her husband's claim to the throne stained. The scandal not only destroyed personal lives, but also threatened the stability of dynastic succession. In the Middle East, tales of powerful women accused of adultery also abound. Legends and chronicles describe queens and princesses condemned, sometimes unjustly, as examples of how even the highest rank offered no shield against suspicion. The mere accusation of adultery was often enough to end influence, exile a woman, or spark wars between factions. Men, too, faced disaster. In Renaissance Italy, where reputation and honor were currency, noblemen accused of seducing married women risked duels or assassination. Courts recorded numerous cases where accusations of adultery ended not in trial, but in blood spilled on the streets. For these men, the danger was not only law, but vengeance. Some famous cases crossed into legend. The biblical story of King David and Bathsheba continued to resonate throughout the medieval period. Though a tale from Scripture, it served as a constant reminder that even kings were not above the dangers of adultery, and that divine punishment could follow those who strayed. In sermons, this story was retold to warn rulers and peasants alike. What unites these stories is the way adultery was magnified when committed by the powerful. A peasant woman paraded through a village might shame her family, but a queen accused of adultery could alter the fate of nations. The stakes were higher, the punishments harsher, and the spectacle grander. Crowds flocked to hear rumors of noble scandals, and chroniclers preserved them as warnings. Even centuries later, these famous cases still fascinate. They reveal the hypocrisy of power, where accusations of adultery could be true sins or convenient tools. They show how fragile reputation was, even for those at the very top of society. And they remind us that adultery, in the eyes of the past, was never only about love or desire. It was about control, inheritance, and the brutal weight of honor. For those caught in these storms, the result was the same: disgrace, punishment, and often death. Their names, however, lived on, their fates becoming lessons for generations. Through their stories, we glimpse how adultery could destroy not only marriages, but dynasties. While the fear of adultery was nearly universal, the ways it was punished varied greatly across regions. Each society shaped its response according to its laws, religions, and cultural values. The differences reveal much about how communities understood honor, purity, and control. In Western Europe, adultery was most often punished through shame and spectacle. Pillories, public parades, and charivaris were common. In Catholic countries, the Church played a dominant role, blending penance with humiliation. France and England, for instance, were rich in rituals of mockery, riding backwards on donkeys, wearing horns, or standing barefoot before congregations. Executions were rare, but the weight of public disgrace was enormous. In Southern Europe, particularly in Italy and Spain, family honor carried special importance. Women accused of adultery risked not only public punishment but also private vengeance. Husbands or male relatives sometimes killed unfaithful women in what became known as crimes of honor. Courts often turned a blind eye, treating these killings as understandable defenses of family dignity. The legal system thus reinforced patriarchal control, making the female body a matter of household survival. In Scandinavia and Northern Europe, punishments could be harsher still. Some medieval laws prescribed mutilation, cutting noses, ears, or even more brutal penalties for adulterers. The harsh climate of justice reflected the importance of inheritance in small, tightly knit communities. A single illegitimate child could fracture delicate systems of property and kinship. In the Middle East and Islamic societies, interpretations of adultery or zina varied but were often severe. Religious law prescribed stoning for adulterers, though in practice this was rare and often replaced by floggings or exile. The stigma, however, was devastating. Women bore the heaviest burdens, as their fidelity was directly linked to family honor. Even accusations could ruin lives. Communities placed immense emphasis on guarding female chastity, with surveillance by family members, neighbors, and local authorities. In South Asia, too, adultery was treated as both a sin and a social crime. Hindu texts condemned it as a threat to dharma, the moral order. Women accused of adultery risked exile or harsh punishments, though the exact form varied across castes and regions. Among elites, it could trigger dynastic disputes or political upheavals, echoing patterns seen in Europe. In East Asia, Confucian ideals placed family loyalty and filial piety above personal desire. Adultery was seen as a betrayal, not only of a spouse, but of the extended family and ancestors. Punishments in imperial China included beatings, exile, and, in severe cases, execution. Women were expected to uphold chastity as a cardinal virtue, and widows who remarried were often stigmatized, reinforcing the obsession with controlling female sexuality. In Africa, responses to adultery were diverse. In some societies, punishment was communal, involving public shaming rituals or reparations to offended families. In others, sorcery or spiritual sanctions were believed to punish the guilty. While not always as codified as European or Middle Eastern laws, the weight of adultery still shaped marriage and community life. What unites all these regions is the central role of honor and inheritance. Everywhere, adultery was framed not only as a personal failing but as a social danger. The intensity of punishment reflected how deeply communities feared disorder. A woman's body was rarely seen as her own. It was tied to family survival, religious purity, or dynastic stability. Yet the variations also remind us that adultery was never a simple or universal category. In some places, it was punished with laughter and shame. In others, with blood and death. In some cultures, men were mocked while women were destroyed. In others, both sexes faced brutal penalties. The differences were as telling as the similarities, showing how each society shaped morality to its own needs. Looking across the world, one truth emerges. Adultery was always more than desire. It was a symbol, a threat, and a test of power. And in every region, the punishment, whether a mocking parade, a whipping, or an execution, was designed not only to correct the guilty, but to remind the community who held authority over love, sex, and loyalty. Though centuries have passed, the echoes of adultery's punishments still shape the way societies think about love, loyalty, and shame. We no longer place adulterers in pillories or shave their heads in public squares, but the cultural memory of these practices lingers. The ghosts of shame, fear, and stigma continue to haunt the modern world. In many places, adultery remains a crime. Some nations still enforce strict laws, punishing infidelity with prison, fines, or even corporal punishment. Religious courts in parts of the Middle East and Africa continue to judge adultery under ancient codes, sometimes with devastating consequences for women. The severity may vary, but the message remains. Fidelity is not only a personal matter, but a public one. Even in countries where adultery is not criminal, social stigma persists. Divorce proceedings often hinge on accusations of infidelity, and public figures caught in affairs face career-ending scandals. The media, like the jeering crowds of the past, thrives on exposure. A celebrity's private betrayal becomes global entertainment, dissected by tabloids and social networks. The tools have changed, but the ritual of public humiliation is strikingly familiar. The language of shame also endures. Terms like homewrecker or cheater carry the same weight as the horns once strapped to adulterers' heads. Women, in particular, still face harsher judgment than men. A man's infidelity may be excused as weakness. A woman's is often condemned as moral failure. The double standard carved into medieval law continues to shape modern gossip. In families, too, the fear of adultery lingers. Jealousy, suspicion, and surveillance remain themes of relationships. Technology has even amplified the culture of control. Phones, emails, and social media create new forms of watchfulness, where secrets are harder to keep and exposure can be instantaneous. A message leaked online can cause as much disgrace today as a procession through a medieval marketplace. Yet there are also signs of change. Some modern cultures view adultery less as a crime and more as a personal failing, one to be resolved privately rather than punished publicly. Ideas of individual freedom and sexual autonomy challenge the centuries-old belief that desire must be controlled by community or church. Still, the shadow of history is not easily erased. The fascination with adultery in stories, films, and literature also reveals how deep the taboo runs. From tragic plays like Othello to modern dramas on television, the theme of infidelity continues to capture attention. The punishments may not involve whips or pillories, but the emotional devastation, the loss of honor, and the risk of ruin echo the past. What lingers most is the memory of humiliation. The idea that intimacy, once exposed, can become shame, is still with us. The medieval woman paraded through town with torn clothes is not so far from the celebrity splashed across headlines for an affair. The tools of exposure have shifted, but the cruelty of watching others' shame remains a constant. The legacy of adultery's punishments reminds us how deeply societies fear disorder in love. Fidelity was never only about the heart. It was about property, power, and stability. By punishing adulterers harshly, past communities reassured themselves that order was preserved. Today, even as laws change, the instinct to shame remains, a remnant of those centuries when adultery was seen as the gravest of threats. In the end, the story of adultery's punishments is not just about cruelty, it is about control. It shows us how private desire became public theater, how the body and the heart were placed under the gaze of church, law, and community. And though we may pride ourselves on progress, the legacy remains visible, reminding us that love has never been free from judgment.